For more on this story, we are now joined by Phelisa Nkomo, Oxfam SA Board Chairperson, and she joins us now via our video link. Phelisa, thank you so much for your time here on SABC News this evening. Let's continue talking about the catastrophe that has hit the Eastern Cape, and that follows those floods in which we saw this week. And let's talk about how government responded to this disaster. What do you make of the manner in which government responded? We also heard there the Premier of the Eastern Cape saying that there should stop being a reactive government and should have proper plans in place.
Well, I do want to say that that's very catastrophic. To lose children while going to school, it's one of the saddest experiences. But I also think that some of the things have really been coming through. You would recall actually that Eastern Cape had actually experienced floods, I think 2 or 3 years ago, and that was the early warning system. And the floods were through Umtata, Butterworth, and as far as Mdantsane. And I like the sentiments that the Premier is actually saying that we should not be reactive, we should actually be more proactive. But I think the proactive work is going to require a lot more intensity. I think part of it is that we need to start getting, firstly, clearly, areas that are likely to be affected in the short term to medium term, and really have long-term plans to move people out of those areas so that they are not affected. I think that's the first thing. I think the second issue is that local municipalities and communities must work together as part of frontline to really help communities to deal with this type of disasters. But I think the third issue for me, fundamental, is actually economics as well. I see the informal settlement in Skate. Most of those people are coming actually from rural communities. They are moving closer to Butterworth, looking for economic opportunities. And what they've done is to occupy any land that is available. But profoundly now, what it means to Eastern Cape government and even South African government is that climate change is real. It's not something that we see it in Italy. It's not something that we see it in Brazil. It's not something that we see it in Mozambique. It's actually happening right in our backyards. So, for instance, if you look at those houses that now are flooded, most of them have no insurance. But we know that families have spent millions in building different homes for themselves. And so the key question is, who is going to be able to help them rebuild their houses? And the likelihood is that they may not have to go back, because what that signals is that areas that have had floods are likely to continuously having floods going forward. So it means that there's an open dialogue that needs to take place around climate change in South Africa with communities, but also these floods are also actually really reconfiguring how our rural villages are organized. Because you know that rural villages historically are organized along cultural rights, along linked with tradition, etc. And I think what is quite clear now is that there needs to be a new urban planning system. In fact, not urban planning, but just a spatial planning to help people out of those areas. Because if they go and rebuild back, it means that consistently they're going to be. Now, but there's also an opportunity, by the way, that we need to use, is that we've had these multilateral agreements over climate finance. And I think it's an opportunity for South Africa to step forward and start accessing those resources to help communities, because South Africa and Africa they contribute probably 1% to climate change or to emissions, to global emissions. But look at how they're actually affected. So South African government needs to be bold and actually start accessing those funds to support, to restore the lives of Black people in Umtata, in Butterworth, any other affected communities. But also it also
and Phelisa, continuing to talk about rebuilding, because that's where we are right now, and a number of people have lost everything. We heard there from our reporter in the Eastern Cape that as many people begin to rebuild their lives, people will be literally starting from scratch. How do people begin to rebuild their lives, particularly coming from a rural development. And when you have the Premier there also talking about the issue of, because it's a rural community, there is no town planning. So where do you begin to pick up the pieces where it is a difficult area to navigate because it's still a rural town?
Absolutely. In fact, hence I was talking about an open conversation over climate change. Because at the heart of it now, it means that we can't build as we used to build before, where you think that, look, my ancestors used to be here, my grandmother and my parents. The first question you must ask is whether, from a climate change perspective, is this area safe to build in? And in essence, it also means that we need to work with communities. Government needs to beef up its capacity to help rural communities around identifying these areas of rebuilding, to identify areas of resettlement. Because what's actually becoming quite clear is that where people are located, and I think if you look at even now, people who are badly affected are people in rural areas and informal settlement. So there needs to be a lot more deeper conversation and a bit of sophistication to support rural people in rural communities so that they are not subjected into this. But also fundamentally, it means that the National Treasury needs to release funding that is actually going to support the rebuilding. Because if you don't support people in rural areas with rebuilding, the risk you have in the short term to medium term is going to lead to land grabs. People are just going to start occupying buildings that are not utilized, but also it means that younger people's lives is going to be disrupted. So there's a whole lot more thinking that needs to be applied in how to resolve this thing in a short term, medium term to long term. But the sentiments that the Premier is actually expressing in this interview are quite encouraging, because they're signaling that he's actually appreciating the challenges a lot more deeper, and it means that there's at least there's going to be a start of a good conversation going forward.
Phelisa, thank you so much for your time. That's Phelisa Nkomo, Oxfam SA board chairperson there, just giving us an insight in terms of what is transpiring and coming out from the Eastern Cape, particularly now as many begin to pick up the pieces and rebuild their homes, and staying with the weather and the impact of that devastation. Let's